They were stuck in a wagon for 4 days and secretly hoped the road would never dry. The rain was not a storm, but a persistent gray erasure of the world, a steady drumming that turned the high desert dust into a thick red clay and kept the two of them tethered to the small, square interior of the freight wagon for the 4th consecutive day. They were traveling toward a railhead that seemed to recede with every mile of mud. Two people who had shared nothing but a contract and a bench seat until the weather forced them back among the crates and the rolled canvas. Jesse sat on a low crate of dry goods, his back against the wooden slats, his hands occupied with the slow, methodical cleaning of a bit and bridle that did not truly need the attention. Across from him, tucked into a nest of wool blankets and grain sacks, Elena watched the way the lantern light caught the oil on his fingers. They were traveling together by necessity, a man hired to drive and a woman moving her life's remaining weight to a sister's house in the north. Yet in the cramped, humid space of the wagon, they existed as two distinct islands of silence. There was no animosity between them, only the profound, exhausted distance of two people who had lived long enough to know that words rarely mended what was truly broken. The interior of the wagon smelled of wet canvas, cedar shavings, and a sharp metallic tang of the lantern oil. Every few minutes the heavy vehicle would shift as the muck settled beneath the wheels, a slow, groaning protest of wood and iron that vibrated through the floorboards and into their bones. Jesse moved the rag in a slow circle, the friction creating a rhythmic shushing sound that sat beneath the patter of the rain. He did not look at Elena, but he was acutely aware of her presence, the soft, repetitive sound of her breathing, the occasional rustle of her skirts as she shifted a weight, the way she smelled faintly of lavender soap and old paper. He focused on the bit, tracing the curve of the steel with a callous thumb, his mind a quiet, empty room. He was a man who had forgotten the sound of his own laughter, and she was a woman whose grief had turned inward, becoming a quiet, steady companion that required no explanation. The lantern swung gently from the center rib of the wagon cover, its flame a steady amber pulse that cast long, dancing shadows across the crates. In this light, the world was reduced to the immediate and the tactile. The grain of the wood in the wagon box was deep and textured, every knot and scar telling a story of previous loads and long-forgotten roads. Jesse reached for a small tin of tallow, the lid coming off with a muted metallic click. He dipped a finger into the tallow, the substance cool and slick against his skin, and began to work it into the leather of the headstall. He did not rush. The afternoon had no end, and the rain showed no sign of relenting. Time was not a sequence of hours, but a series of small, repetitive actions that kept the mind anchored to the present. Elena shifted in a corner, a movement causing a grain sack to settle with a soft, dusty thud. She watched his hands. They were large hands, mapped with the scars of a decade spent working rope and iron. Yet they moved with a gentleness that seemed out of place in a man of his stature. She reached out and pulled the edge of a blanket over her knees, the wool rough and scratchy against her palms. The cold was beginning to seep through the canvas, a damp, intrusive chill that settled in the corners of the wagon. She did not speak. To speak would be to break the fragile equilibrium they had established, a peace built on the understanding that neither was required to perform for the other. "The wind's turning," Jesse said, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Elena looked toward the puckered opening at the back of the wagon, where the gray light of the afternoon was fading into a deep, bruised purple. Will it turn to snow? Likely. That was the extent of their dialogue for the hour. Jesse went back to the leather, his movements unchanged. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was a shared silence, a space they occupied together rather than two separate voids. He finished the headstall and set it aside, the leather creaking softly as it settled. He stood up, his joints popping in the quiet, and moved toward the front of the wagon to check the tie-downs. His boots made a solid, rhythmic sound on the wood, a comforting thud that spoke of weight and permanence. He reached for the coffee pot that sat on a small shielded spirit stove in the corner, the metal clinking against the grate. The process of making coffee was a slow liturgy. He measured the grounds with a small tin scoop, the scent of the roasted beans sharp and dark in the humid air. He poured water from a leather skin, the liquid splashing into the pot with a clean, hollow sound. He struck a match, the sudden flare of sulfur and phosphorus illuminating the interior of the wagon for a heartbeat before settling into the blue hiss of the stove. He sat back on his crate and waited. The steam began to rise, a thin white ghost that curled toward the lantern light. Elena watched the steam. She felt the vibration of the stove through the floor, a tiny, industrious humming that felt like the heart of their small world. She realized that she had stopped thinking about the destination, the railhead, the sister, the life that waited for her. All of it felt like a dream she had had a long time ago. The reality was the smell of the coffee, the sound of the rain, and the solid, unmoving presence of the man sitting 3 feet away. She felt a strange sense of safety, a feeling that as long as they remained within the canvas walls, the world could not reach them. Jesse poured the coffee into 2 mismatched tin mugs, the liquid dark and steaming. He handed one to Elena, his fingers grazing hers for a second. The heat of the mug seeped into her palms, a grounding warmth that made her shoulders drop. He did not look for a thank you, and she did not offer one. They sat in the amber light, blowing the steam from their mugs, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of the rain and the occasional snort of the mules tethered outside. The night arrived in earnest, the darkness outside the wagon becoming an absolute velvet wall. The rain changed its tune, the drumming becoming a sharper, crystalline rattling. Jesse stood and peered through the back opening, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the gray light. "It's icing," he said. "The mules?" "They're hunkered. I'll go out and double the blankets." He pulled on his heavy canvas coat, the fabric stiff and smelling of dry earth. He stepped out of the wagon, and for a moment the damp cold rushed in, a sudden bracing intrusion of the world. He listened to his movements, the crunch of his boots on the freezing mud, the low, soothing tones of his voice as he spoke to the animals, the rhythmic slap of the blankets being settled. He was out there in the dark, moving through the ice, ensuring the survival of the team. She felt a sudden sharp pang of awareness of her own dependency, but it was not the jagged fear she had expected. It was a soft, heavy realization that she was being cared for. When he returned, he was shivering, his coat shimmering with a fine glaze of ice. He stripped it off and hung it near the opening, the water dripping on the floorboards with a rhythmic patter. He moved to the stove and rubbed his hands together, the skin red and raw from the cold. Elena reached into a bag and pulled out a small jar of salve, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not ask. She simply took his hand in hers and began to rub the ointment into his knuckles. His hand was large and calloused, the skin like old parchment. She moved her thumbs in slow circles,
the warmth of her palms transferring to his skin. Jesse'd go perfectly still. He did not pull away, but he did not lean in. He watched her hands, his breathing hitching for a fraction of a second before settling into a deep, steady rhythm. The silence in the wagon was absolute, a profound and healing peace that seemed to expand to fill the space. There was no romance in the gesture, only the basic human necessity of care. "Thank you," Jesse whispered, his voice barely audible above the hiss of the stove. "The ice is hard on the skin."
She finished and let go of his hand. The absence of the contact was a physical sensation, a sudden cooling of the air. Jesse sat back on his crate, his hands resting on his knees. He looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes were not focused on a task or the road. He saw the way the lamplight softened the lines of her face, the way her hair was beginning to escape its pins, the way she sat with her shoulders hunched against the cold. He saw a woman who was just as tired as he was. The evening stretched into the deep hours of the night. They did not light the lantern again once it burned low, preferring the soft red glow of the spirit stove. The interior of the wagon became a study in shadows and textures, the rough weave of the blankets, the cold iron of the crates, the scent of the drying leather. Jesse moved from his crate to the floor, spreading his bedroll near the front of the wagon. Elena lay back in her nest of sacks, pulling the wool blankets up to her chin. The silence was punctuated by the small domestic sounds of a shared life, the rustle of a blanket, the deep rhythmic sigh of a person settling into sleep, the soft click of the stove as it cooled. Jesse lay on his back, staring up at the dark ribs of the wagon. He thought of the years he had spent sleeping on the hard ground, the silence of the trail his only companion. He realized that the silence tonight was different. It was a populated silence. It was a silence that held the weight of another soul. In the morning, the light that seeped through the canvas was a pale, diffused silver. The world was frozen. Jesse woke first, his movements hushed as he began the ritual of the fire and the coffee. He watched Elena as she slept. She looked fragile in the dawn light, the shadows under her eyes a testament to the miles they had traveled. He did not move to wake her. He sat by the stove, his hands wrapped around a mug, and watched the frost patterns on the wagon ribs. When she finally stirred, she did not startle at his presence. She sat up slowly, her hair a wild, dark halo around her head. She looked at him and then at the coffee pot. "Still icing?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Stopped an hour ago. The sun's trying to break. Can we move?" "Not yet. The mud's frozen on top, but soft underneath. We'd bogged the wagon." So they stayed. They stayed through the morning and the long, bright afternoon. They moved through the small space with a fluid, instinctive grace, their bodies having learned the geography of the wagon and the timing of each other's motions. Jesse spent the afternoon mending a tear in one of the canvas side flaps, his needle moving in and out of the heavy fabric with a rhythmic shushing sound. Elena sat near him, sorting through a box of her sister's old books, the paper yellowed and smelling of dust. They did not talk much, but the silence was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge. Every few hours they would share a meal, hardtack and dried fruit, or a bowl of beans heated on the stove. The acts of eating and drinking became shared rituals, small anchors in the vast white sea of the day. Love was not a word they used, and it was not a feeling they discussed.
It was simply the atmosphere of the wagon, the scent of the cedar, and the warmth of the coffee. As the sun began to set, casting long golden fingers through the puckered opening of the wagon, Jesse finished his mending. He set the needle and thread aside and sat back, his back against the wooden slats. He looked at Elena, who was reading a book by the fading light. "I had a house once," he said, suddenly, the words falling into the quiet room like a stone into a still pond. Elena looked up, her finger marking her place in the book. "Where?" "In the valley, before the drought took the creek." "Did you leave it?" "The wind took the rest, nothing left to stay for." He did not elaborate, and she did not ask. The information was enough. It was a piece of his map, a small, jagged fragment of the man he had been. Elena closed her book and set it aside. She looked at the gold light on the floorboards. "I had a garden," she said, softly. "The soil was black. You could grow anything if you had the water." "Hard to find water in this country." "Yes." They sat in the deepening twilight, the memory of the house and the garden hanging in the air. They were two people who had lost their foundations, now finding that they could stand on the shifting floor of a freight wagon as long as they stood together. The realization was not a dramatic one. It was a slow, steady accumulation of safety. The fourth night was the coldest. The ice on the canvas groaned as the temperature dropped, and the air inside the wagon was a sharp, brittle thing. They sat close to the spirit stove, their blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Jesse moved from his crate to the floor near Elena, the space between them narrowing until their shoulders touched. The contact was a shock of warmth, a grounding reality in the freezing dark. They did not move apart. They sat in the red glow of the stove, the only sound their breathing and the rhythmic ticking of the cooling metal. Jesse felt the weight of her shoulder against his arm, a soft, living pressure that made the hair on his neck stand up. He realized that he didn't want the mud to dry. He didn't want the sun to come out. He wanted to stay in the dark, in the cold, in the quiet proximity of the woman beside him. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, a slow, tentative movement. She felt the solid, unmoving strength of him, the way he smelled of cedar and work. She closed her eyes. "We'll be at the railhead in 2 days if the sun holds." "Likely so." "And then you'll go back south." "The company's got a load waiting." The thought of the South, of the long, lonely miles of the trail, felt like a physical weight in Jesse's chest. He looked at the shadows on the canvas. He thought of the silence of the trail, the silence that was empty. He looked at the woman resting her head on his shoulder. "I might stay a while," he said. "The mules need a rest." "They do." She did not ask him to stay, and he did not promise to, but the words were there, a small flickering light in the dark. They sat in the silence for a long time, the warmth of their bodies creating a small private climate under the wool blankets. The morning of the 5th day broke with a brilliant, blinding clarity. The sun hit the canvas and turned the wagon into a palace of shimmering silver. The mud was firm, the road open. Jesse stepped out of the wagon and stood in the crisp, cold air, his boots crunching on the frozen earth. He looked at the horizon, at the long, winding path that led toward the north. He went to the mules, his movements efficient and practiced as he harnessed the team. He felt the sun on his back, a promise of warmth that actually felt real. Elena stepped out of the wagon, her face pale in the bright light. She looked at the road and then at him. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." She climbed onto the bench seat, and Jesse joined her, the leather creaking under their weight. He took the reins in his hands, the familiar weight of the leather a grounding sensation. He clicked to the mules, and the wagon lurched forward, the wheels cutting through the thin glaze of ice. They sat side by side on the bench, the wind in their faces, the vast, empty landscape unfolding before them. They did not talk much, but they needed not to. The 4 days in the wagon had written a new language between them, a language of shared space and quiet presence. When they reached the railhead at dusk on the 7th day, the town was a jumble of lights and noise, a sudden jarring intrusion of the world. Jesse brought the wagon to a halt in front of the sister's house, a small white-painted structure with a light in the window. He climbed down and helped Elena from the seat, his hands firm around her waist. He began to unload her crates, moving with a slow, methodical precision. He did not rush. He watched the way she stood on the porch, her silhouette a jagged shadow against the lamplight. He felt a sense of finality approaching, a closing of a door.
When the last crate was on the porch, he stood by the wagon, his hands in his pockets. The sister came to the door, a flurry of excitement and noise that seemed to push the quiet of the trail away. Elena looked at him, her eyes steady in the flickering light. "You'll come by for coffee tomorrow?" she asked. "The company's expecting a wagon back. The mules need a rest, Jesse." He looked at her, and then he looked at the wagon, and then he looked at the long, dark road that led back toward the south. He thought of the silence of the freight yard and the silence of the campfire. Then he looked back at the woman on the porch. "I reckon they do," he said. He did not stay for dinner, and he did not make a speech. He simply moved the wagon to the livery and took a room at the boarding house. He spent the evening cleaning his boots, the rhythmic sound of the brush against the leather a familiar, grounding liturgy. He thought of the way her hand had felt on his knuckles, the way her head had rested on his shoulder. The next morning, the sun was warm and the air smelled of wood smoke. Jesse walked to the sister's house, his boots making a solid, rhythmic thud on the boardwalk. He did not feel like a man who was passing through. He felt like a man who was arriving. He found Elena in the small garden behind the house, her sleeves rolled up, her hands lost in the black soil. She was clearing the dead weeds from the previous year, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up as he approached, a small, tired smile on her face. "The soil's good here," she said, gesturing toward the earth. "Needs a bit of turning." "It does." Jesse took the shovel from the porch and began to work the earth beside her. He did not ask, and she did not offer. They worked in the silence of the morning, the only sound the rhythmic bite of the shovel and the distant whistle of a train. They worked side by side, their shadows lengthening across the black soil, 2 tired souls finally resting in the same place. The afternoon turned into a long golden crawl of light. They sat on the back steps of the house, their shoulders touching, watching the sun dip toward the mountains. The silence was absolute, a profound and healing peace that required no words. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, a slow, natural movement. She felt the solid, unmoving strength of him, the way he smelled of cedar and work. She did not speak, and neither did he. They sat in the golden light, the garden waiting before them, the long road behind them. Jesse did not move to leave, and neither did she. They simply stayed there in the quiet proximity of the afternoon as the first stars began to pierce the indigo sky. He stayed for the coffee, and he stayed for the dinner, and he stayed through the long, quiet hours of the evening. They did not talk about the future, and they did not discuss their feelings. They simply occupied the same space, their bodies having learned the rhythm of each other's presence. As the night deepened, they sat by the hearth in the sisters' parlor, the firelight dancing in orange flickers across the ceiling. The house was quiet, the sister having gone to bed hours ago. Jesse watched the way the light played across Elena's face. He felt a surge of tenderness so strong it made his breath catch. He reached out and covered a hand, his palm broad and warm. She did not pull away. She interlaced her fingers with his, her skin soft against his calloused palm. They sat in the silence, watching the fire burn down to embers, two people who had found their foundation in the middle of a storm. The next day, Jesse went to the freight office and told them he wouldn't be taking the load south. He didn't give a reason, and they didn't ask. He went back to the garden and the house and the woman with the black soil on her hands. The weeks turned into months, the seasons continuing their slow chromatic shift. The routine of the house and the garden became a liturgy, a series of repetitive acts that grounded them in the immediate and the real. They worked together, ate together, and sat in the silence together. The love was not a dramatic thing. It was a slow, steady accumulation of safety, a feeling that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. They did not speak of the house in the valley or the garden that had died. They spoke of the seeds they were planting and the fence they were building. They spoke of the weather and the mules and the color of the sunset. They lived in the present, in the quiet proximity of each other, their bodies having become a single fluid motion. One evening, in the late autumn, the first snow began to fall, a fine, dry powder that hissed against the window panes. They sat by the hearth, the firelight orange and warm. Jesse was cleaning a piece of harness leather, the rhythmic sound of the rag a familiar pulse in the room. Elena was mending a wool blanket, her needle moving in and out with a soft, rhythmic hiss. The silence was profound, a deep and resonant peace that filled the house. Jesse looked at Elena, her head bowed over her work, the firelight catching the gray in her hair. He felt a surge of tenderness so strong it made his breath catch. He reached out and touched her forearm, a brief, light contact. "It's a good fire, Jesse," she said. "It is." They sat in the silence, watching the snow accumulate on the windowsill, two people who had found their rest in the middle of a vast, indifferent world. The journey was over. The road was gone. There was only the house, the fire, and the quiet presence of the other. As the night wore on, the fire burned down to a deep glowing bed of coals. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in. Jesse moved from his chair to the floor near Elena, the space between them narrowing until their shoulders touched. They sat in the red glow of the embers, their breathing a synchronized rhythm in the quiet. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes half closed. She felt the solid, unmoving strength of him, the way he smelled of cedar and work. She did not speak, and neither did he. They sat in the dark, in the warmth, in the quiet proximity of the afternoon, as the first stars began to pierce the indigo sky. Jesse stayed. He didn't move to get up, and he didn't offer a reason. He simply remained where he was, his shoulder supporting her weight, his hand resting near hers. He watched the shadows on the wall, thinking of nothing at all, content in the simple, heavy reality of the present. The snow continued to fall outside, a silent white blanket that erased the world. Inside the house, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke. The two of them sat in the silence, their shadows merged into a single jagged shape against the logs. They were not two people anymore.
They were a shared existence, a slow-moving machine geared for endurance. Elena's breathing deepened, her head slumping slightly more against his shoulder. She had fallen asleep without meaning to, the weight of her body a trust that Jesse felt in the marrow of his bones. He reached out with his far hand and pulled a stray blanket over her shoulders, his movements hushed and careful. She stirred slightly, a hand reaching out in her sleep until her fingers brushed his wrist. She did not wake, but she held on, her grip firm and certain. Jesse looked at her hand, the small, pale fingers against his dark, weathered skin. He did not move his arm. He stayed exactly where he was, his back against the chair, his heart quiet. The morning would bring the snow shoveling and the fire starting and the long, slow work of the winter. But for now, there was only the dark, the warmth, and the quiet presence of the other. Jesse closed his eyes and let the silence of the room pull him toward a deep, dreamless sleep, his hand still held by the woman beside him. The road was gone. The journey was over. He was home. The clock on the mantel ticked, a slow and stubborn pulse in the quiet. The fire gave one last soft pop and settled into gray ash. The two of them sat unmoving in the shadows, two tired souls finally resting in the same place. The night deepened, the silence became absolute. Outside, the world was a vast white emptiness. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke. Jesse stayed, Elena slept, and the silence was enough.